Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The autumn of 2014 brought an unusual warmth to northeastern Connecticut that lingered well into October. At 32, I had been living in the same rural house for nearly 5 years, and my daily walks with Ranger, my chocolate Labrador, had become as routine as breathing. The dirt road we traveled stretched for exactly 2 miles through dense woodland, connecting my property to the old mill district where time seemed frozen in the 1800s. That particular Tuesday afternoon felt different from the moment I stepped outside. The air hung heavy despite the sunshine, thick with the scent of decomposing leaves and something else I couldn't identify, something metallic and sharp that made my sinuses burn. Ranger trotted beside me with his usual enthusiasm, his tongue lolling as he investigated every roadside scent with scientific precision. The road itself had always possessed an oppressive quality that I attributed to the towering oaks and maples that formed a natural tunnel overhead. Their branches intertwined so thickly that even on the brightest days, the path remained dim and cool. Today, however, the shadows seemed deeper, more substantial, as if they possessed weight and intention. I had walked this route hundreds of times over the years. I knew every pothole, every fallen log, every bend in the path. The familiarity should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like walking through a place that was pretending to be somewhere I knew. The trees looked the same. The curves of the road followed their expected patterns, yet something fundamental had shifted in a way I couldn't articulate. Ranger suddenly stopped, his ears perked forward, nose twitching as he analyzed some invisible signal. His body went rigid, the relaxed panting replaced by alert tension. I followed his gaze toward the tree line, but saw nothing unusual, just the same dense undergrowth of ferns and fallen branches that had always bordered our path. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. He remained frozen for nearly 30 seconds before shaking his head and resuming his casual pace, as if whatever had captured his attention had simply vanished. Dogs often detected things beyond human perception, distant sounds, unfamiliar scents, the approach of other animals. I dismissed the moment and continued walking, though a subtle unease had begun to build in my chest. The silence struck me as we progressed deeper along the road. On previous walks, the woods buzzed with constant activity, squirrels chattering in the branches, insects humming in the underbrush, the occasional crack of a branch as some unseen creature moved through the forest. Today, the only sounds were our footsteps on the packed dirt and Ranger's steady breathing. Even the wind had stilled. The leaves hung motionless on their branches, not even the slightest breeze disturbing their autumn display. It was as if the entire forest held itself in suspension, waiting for some signal that never came. As we approached the halfway point of our usual route, where an ancient stone wall marked the boundary between old property lines, the first bird call reached my ears. The sound cut through the oppressive silence like a blade through fabric. I stopped walking immediately, tilting my head to better locate its source. It came from somewhere to my left, perhaps 50 feet into the woods, a complex sequence of notes unlike anything I had heard before. The call began with a low, warbling trill that rose gradually in pitch before breaking into a series of sharp, staccato clicks. Then came a haunting, descending whistle that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. The entire sequence lasted perhaps 8 seconds, followed by complete silence. I prided myself on my knowledge of local bird species. Growing up in Connecticut, I had developed a passion for ornithology that continued into adulthood. My field guides were dog-eared from use, and I could identify dozens of species by their calls alone. This sound belonged to none of them. Ranger showed no reaction to the call, continuing to sniff at a particularly interesting clump of leaves beside the road. His indifference struck me as odd. Usually he would at least glance toward any significant sound in the woods. I waited, listening intently for the call to repeat. The silence stretched on for perhaps 2 minutes before the sound came again, this time from what seemed like a slightly different location. The sequence was identical. The same warbling trill, the same staccato clicks, the same impossible echo on the final whistle. My curiosity ignited into something stronger. In 5 years of daily walks, I had cataloged every bird that frequented these woods. The discovery of a new species, or even a rare visitor blown off course during migration, would be genuinely exciting. I scanned the canopy above the presumed source of the call, searching for any movement among the leaves. The third call came after another long pause, and this time I was certain it had moved. The sound now originated from a point at least 20 feet closer to the road, though still well within the tree line. I studied the area carefully, looking for the telltale flutter of wings or the bob of a head among the branches. Nothing. A rational mind would have attributed this to the acoustic properties of the forest. Sounds could be deceptive among trees, bouncing off trunks and being distorted by undergrowth. But something about the precision of the calls bothered me. They came at almost exactly 3-minute intervals, and each time they seemed to have moved precisely the same distance toward the road. The fourth call confirmed my suspicion. The bird, if it was a bird, now called from a position barely 30 feet from where I stood. I should have been able to see it clearly at that distance, yet the woods appeared completely still. No movement in the branches, no rustle of leaves, no flash of feathers catching the filtered sunlight. My fascination began to curdle into something less pleasant. I had been standing motionless on the road for nearly 15 minutes, staring into the woods like a man hypnotized. Ranger had completed his investigation of the leaf pile and now sat patiently beside me, occasionally looking up with the resigned expression of a dog whose human had developed another incomprehensible obsession. The fifth call came from the very edge of the woods, perhaps 15 feet away. At this distance, I should not only have been able to see the creature, but to observe individual feathers and the subtle movements of its head as it vocalized. The fact that I could detect nothing, absolutely nothing, began to feel deliberately insulting. A sixth call followed, and with growing alarm, I realized it had come from behind me. I spun around quickly, scanning the woods on the opposite side of the road. The call had definitely originated from that direction, perhaps 20 feet into the tree line. But that meant whatever was making these sounds had somehow crossed the road without my noticing, an impossibility given how intently I had been watching. Ranger stood and shook himself, apparently deciding our extended pause had gone on long enough. He began walking again, pulling gently against his leash to encourage our continued progress down the road. Part of me wanted to follow his lead, to resume our normal routine and leave this mystery unsolved. But the scientific part of my mind rebelled against that impulse. I had spent years studying bird behavior, migration patterns, and vocalizations. The idea that some species could exist in these woods without my knowledge felt like a personal failure. Every documented discovery began with someone willing to investigate the unexplained. I called out to Ranger to sit and stay, then stepped off the road toward the source of the most recent call. The transition from packed dirt to forest floor felt significant, as if I had crossed some invisible threshold. The temperature dropped noticeably under the canopy, and the quality of light shifted from the warm gold of afternoon sunshine to a greenish twilight filtered through countless leaves. My footsteps on the thick carpet of fallen leaves created more noise than I had expected. Each step produced a complex symphony of cracks, rustles, and crunches that seemed to announce my presence to every creature within 100 yards. If a bird had been calling from this area, my approach should have frightened it into flight or at least silence. Instead, the call came again. This time from directly ahead of me, perhaps 10 feet away. I froze, scanning the area with microscopic intensity. At this distance, the creature should have been clearly visible. I could see individual twigs, the pattern of bark on nearby trees, the way spiderwebs caught fragments of sunlight between the branches. Nothing moved, nothing flew, nothing disturbed even a single leaf. The call repeated from the same location, and for the first time, I began to doubt whether I was actually hearing what I thought I was hearing. The sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely, manifesting directly inside my head like a memory of hearing rather than the act itself. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that it was real, external, and deliberately positioned just beyond my ability to locate its source. I took 3 more steps forward, my eyes burning from the intensity of my scrutiny. A low branch caught my jacket, and the brief tug of fabric against wood startled me more than it should have. My heart rate had elevated significantly, though I couldn't identify why a simple bird call should provoke such a physical response. The next call came from behind me and to the left. I turned again, more slowly this time, and realized I could no longer see the road clearly through the trees. Had I really walked that far into the woods? The distance couldn't have been more than 15 or 20 feet, yet the familiar ribbon of dirt that had guided our walks for 5 years seemed to have vanished entirely. A creeping sensation began at the base of my skull. Not quite fear, but its preliminary stages. The feeling of having made a mistake whose consequences had not yet become apparent. I had entered the woods casually, almost thoughtlessly, pursuing what seemed like an innocent mystery. Now, surrounded by trees that suddenly seemed taller and more densely packed than they had appeared from the road, I began to question the wisdom of that decision. The bird call came again, and this time I was certain it had moved to yet another location, deeper into the woods and further from the road. The pattern was becoming clear. No matter where I positioned myself, the source of the calls would always be just out of sight, just far enough away to require a few more steps to investigate. For the first time since this began, I considered the possibility that I was being deliberately led somewhere. The thought hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I was being led. The calls weren't random bird vocalizations or even the territorial displays of some unknown species. They were purposeful, calculated, designed to draw me deeper into the woods step by step. But that was impossible. Birds didn't engage in complex deception. They lacked the cognitive capacity for such elaborate manipulation. Even the most intelligent species, crows, ravens, certain parrots, operated on instinct and simple learned behaviors. The idea that some creature was deliberately guiding my movements through acoustic manipulation bordered on the paranoid. Yet the evidence of my own experience contradicted every rational explanation. The precise timing of the calls, the systematic way they had moved to draw me from the road, the complete absence of any visible source despite optimal viewing conditions. None of it aligned with normal animal behavior. I stood motionless among the trees, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No insect sounds, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, no distant bird calls other than the mysterious sequence that had brought me here. Even the ever-present background noise of modern life, distant traffic, airplane engines, the hum of electrical transformers, seemed to have been muffled into nothing. The silence felt aggressive, like a living thing pressing against my eardrums. In that oppressive quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, the rush of blood through my veins, the barely audible whistle of air through my nostrils. These internal sounds, normally masked by environmental noise, now seemed unnaturally loud and intrusive. I tried to remember exactly how I had gotten to this position. The sequence of steps that had led me from the road to my current location among the trees felt fuzzy, dreamlike. I remembered the first call, my decision to investigate, the sensation of stepping into the woods. But the specific path I had taken, the precise moment-by-moment progression, seemed to slip away when I tried to focus on it. Looking around, I attempted to identify landmarks that would help me navigate back to the road. That large oak with the distinctive split trunk. Had I passed it on my way in? The moss-covered boulder to my right looked familiar. but I couldn't remember whether I had approached it from this angle or another. The forest, which had seemed like a simple extension of my familiar walking route, now revealed itself as a complex maze of similar-looking trees and repeating patterns. The bird call came again, and this time I felt something like vertigo as I realized I couldn't accurately determine its direction. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, as if the trees themselves were producing it through some impossible acoustic phenomenon. I called out Ranger's name, hoping to hear his response and use it to orient myself toward the road. The sound of my own voice startled me, harsh and foreign in the suffocating silence. It seemed to be absorbed by the trees before it could travel more than a few feet, as if the forest was actively suppressing any sound I made. No answering bark came from Ranger. No jingle of his collar tags, no sound of his movement on the road. For the first time, genuine fear began to coalesce in my chest. I had left him sitting at the edge of the road, clearly visible from my position in the woods. At this distance, I should have been able to hear him if he moved or made any sound at all. The possibility that I had wandered much further than I realized began to seem not just likely but inevitable. Time had become elastic during my pursuit of the calls. What felt like a few minutes of investigation could have been 20 minutes or longer. I could have covered significant ground without realizing it, drawn by the systematic progression of sounds deeper into the woods than I had ever ventured before. Another call echoed through the trees, and I made a conscious decision not to respond to it. Whatever was producing these sounds, bird, animal, or something else entirely, it was not going to lead me any further from safety. I turned in what I hoped was the direction of the road and began walking with determined steps. Within moments, I realized I had no idea which direction I was actually traveling. Every direction looked identical. The forest had transformed from a familiar border along my walking route into an endless repetition of tree trunks, fallen logs, and undergrowth that seemed to shift and rearrange itself when I wasn't looking directly at it. The logical part of my mind insisted this was impossible. I had only walked a short distance from the road, and the woods in this area were neither large nor particularly dense. But logic felt increasingly irrelevant as I pushed through the undergrowth, searching for any sign of the path I had taken to get here. The thick carpet of leaves beneath my feet showed no trace of my passage, as if the forest floor had somehow sealed itself behind me. Even my most recent footprints seemed to have vanished, leaving no evidence that I had ever disturbed this place. I attempted to establish a systematic search pattern, walking in what I hoped was a straight line for 50 steps before turning and walking perpendicular to my original direction. This grid approach should have led me to the road within minutes, given the relatively small area of woodland between the dirt path and the nearest cleared land. Instead, I found myself deeper in the forest than ever. The trees here were older, larger, their trunks bearing the scarred bark of centuries of growth. Some reached diameters that would have required several people holding hands to encircle. I had never seen trees of this size in the area, and their presence suggested I had somehow traveled much further than seemed possible in the time available. More disturbing than the change in vegetation was the quality of light filtering through the canopy. When I had first entered the woods, the afternoon sun had cast distinct shadows and created patches of bright illumination between the leaves. Now the light seemed diffuse and sourceless, as if it emerged from the air itself rather than from any particular direction. The result was a twilight effect that made it impossible to determine the time of day or even the cardinal directions. My watch provided no help. The face had gone black, as if the battery had died suddenly. I pressed the buttons and tapped the crystal, but the display remained dark. The watch had been working perfectly that morning, and I had charged it just 2 days earlier. Electronic devices sometimes malfunctioned in the woods due to humidity or temperature changes, but the complete failure of the display felt ominous rather than coincidental. The bird call came again, closer than ever before. This time, however, something in the sound had changed. The same sequence of notes continued. The warbling trill, the staccato clicks, the descending whistle. But underneath lay a new element that raised the hair on my arms. a barely audible undertone that sounded disturbingly like laughter. Not human laughter, but something that mimicked the rhythm and cadence of amusement while remaining fundamentally alien. It was as if whatever produced the calls had grown confident enough to reveal a hint of its true nature, secure in the knowledge that I was now too lost to pose any threat to its purposes. I began moving faster, crashing through the underbrush with less regard for stealth or direction. Branches caught at my clothing and scratched my exposed skin, but I pushed forward with increasing desperation. The logical voice in my head continued to insist that I was overreacting, that I was probably still within 100 yards of the road, that my disorientation was temporary and would resolve itself if I remained calm. But my body knew better. My heart hammered against my ribs with the urgent rhythm of genuine terror. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool temperature under the trees. My breathing became shallow and rapid, as if the air itself had grown thin and inadequate. The calls began coming from multiple directions simultaneously. At first, I thought it might be an echo effect, the original sound bouncing off tree trunks and creating false impressions of multiple sources. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the calls were overlapping but not identical. The same basic sequence repeated from different positions around me, but with subtle variations in timing and pitch that suggested multiple sources rather than acoustic reflections. This revelation brought with it a crushing understanding. I was surrounded. Whatever had been leading me deeper into the woods was not alone. The systematic progression of calls that had drawn me from the road had been coordinated, planned, executed by multiple entities working in concert. The precision of their movements, the way they had maintained their invisibility while staying just close enough to ensure I would follow, it spoke to an intelligence far beyond anything I was prepared to accept. The laughter in the calls grew more pronounced, and for the first time, I began to run. Running through dense forest while in a state of panic proved to be a special kind of nightmare. Low branches slashed at my face and caught my clothing, forcing me to duck and weave while maintaining forward momentum. Roots hidden beneath the thick layer of leaves sent me stumbling repeatedly, each near fall threatening to send me crashing into the unforgiving trunks that surrounded me. The calls followed my frantic progress, now coming from all directions with increased frequency. The overlapping sequences created a disorienting auditory maze that made it impossible to determine which way might lead to safety. Worse, the sounds seemed to anticipate my movements, appearing ahead of me no matter which direction I chose to run. My lungs burned as I gasped for air that felt thick and resistant, as if the atmosphere under the canopy had a different composition than normal air. Each breath required conscious effort, and I found myself growing dizzy from the combination of oxygen deprivation and absolute terror. After what felt like hours but could have been only minutes, I stumbled into a small clearing and stopped, doubling over with my hands on my knees as I struggled to catch my breath. The open space felt like a temporary reprieve, though the circle of trees surrounding it seemed to lean inward like spectators gathering around an arena. In the relative quiet of my exhausted pause, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the thunderous pounding of my heart. But underneath these sounds, something else became audible, a soft rustling that seemed to come from the tree line around the clearing's perimeter. I straightened slowly, every muscle in my body tensed for immediate flight. The rustling continued, a gentle susurrus that suggested movement in the branches above eye level. As I scanned the trees around the clearing, I began to detect subtle shifts in the shadows, dark shapes that moved with deliberate purpose among the leaves. The shapes were too large to be birds, too coordinated to be random wind movement. They maintained positions at roughly equal intervals around the clearing's circumference, as if they had arranged themselves to ensure no escape route remained unwatched. When I focused directly on any single location, the movement would cease. But I could sense it resuming in my peripheral vision the moment I looked away. The bird calls began again, but now they came from directly overhead. The sound rained down from the canopy like an auditory assault, each sequence overlapping with the others until the individual calls merged into a continuous wall of alien noise. The laughter that had been barely detectable before now dominated the sound, harsh and mocking and utterly without warmth. I understood with crystalline clarity that this had been the plan from the beginning. The systematic progression of calls along the road, the careful way I had been led deeper into the woods, the gradual revelation of multiple sources, all of it had been designed to bring me to this clearing. I was exactly where they wanted me to be. The question that remained was, what did they want? As if in response to my unspoken query, the calls suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the cacophony that had preceded it. In that absolute quiet, I could hear the soft rustle of movement in the trees growing closer, descending toward my level. I looked up and saw them clearly for the first time. They weren't birds. They weren't anything that should have existed in the forests of Connecticut or anywhere else on Earth. Dark shapes roughly the size of ravens, but wrong in every detail. Too angular, too purposeful, with appendages that bent in directions that violated basic anatomy. Their surfaces seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating gaps in the canopy that hurt to look at directly. As I watched in paralyzed horror, they began to speak. Not bird calls now, but words. Human words in voices that almost but not quite managed to sound human. The same phrases repeated from different positions around the clearing, overlapping and echoing until they became a chant. Come closer. Come see. Come know what waits. Come know what watches. Come know what remembers. The voices were individually wrong. Too high in some places, too low in others, with emphasis on syllables that made the words sound like a foreign language poorly translated. But together, they created a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to reach directly into my brain and command compliance. My feet began moving forward without my conscious decision. The compulsion to approach the trees felt like someone else was controlling my muscles. Each step required enormous effort to resist, as if I was walking against a powerful current that threatened to sweep me toward the dark shapes waiting in the branches. The chanting voices grew louder as I drew closer, their words blending into a single overwhelming command that seemed to bypass my conscious mind entirely. Come closer. Come see. Come know. Part of me wanted to obey. The rational part of my brain had long since shut down, overwhelmed by experiences that had no place in any reasonable understanding of reality. What remained was a primitive survival instinct that screamed danger and something else. A terrible curiosity about what these things actually were and what they wanted from me. I managed to stop walking when I reached the edge of the clearing, perhaps 10 feet from the nearest tree. At this distance, the dark shapes above me resolved into forms that made my stomach lurch with revulsion. They had the general outline of large birds, but their proportions were all wrong. Necks too long, wings too narrow, heads that swiveled with mechanical precision, rather than natural movement. Most disturbing were their eyes. Instead of the bright, alert gaze of normal birds, these creatures had eyes like black holes, spheres of absolute darkness that seemed to pull light into them and give nothing back. When they focused on me, I felt as if I was being examined by something that existed outside the normal rules of biology and physics. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound I can only describe as breathing. Though these things showed no signs of having lungs or any other respiratory system. The breathing came from all directions simultaneously, a rhythmic rush of air that seemed to synchronize with my own panicked gasps. Then one of them spoke in a voice that was almost human, almost familiar. You walk the same path every day. You walk where others walked before. You walk where others learned what we are. The voice belonged to no one I knew, yet something about its cadence and inflection felt hauntingly familiar, as if I was hearing an echo of a conversation from long ago. Other voices joined in, each speaking in the same almost familiar tone. The mill workers walked here. The mill workers learned. The mill workers stayed. The families in the old house walked here. They learned. They stayed. Everyone who walks here learns. Everyone who learns stays. Now you have walked here. Now you will learn. Now you will stay. Understanding crashed over me like ice water. The abandoned foundations I passed on every walk, the old house with its crumbling outhouse, the complete absence of any human habitation in an area that should have supported a thriving community. It all suddenly made horrible sense. People had lived here once. Families, workers, entire communities had called this place home. And then, one by one, they had encountered something in the woods that had changed them, claimed them, incorporated them into itself. The dark shapes in the trees weren't just some unknown species that had evolved in isolation. They were the result of that claiming, the transformed remnants of everyone who had ever been lured into the forest by those impossible bird calls. "What are you?" I whispered, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. The breathing sound intensified, and when the voices responded, they came in a rush of overlapping words that revealed the awful truth. "We are the miller who heard the calls in 1823. We are his wife who followed him into the trees. We are their children who could not resist the voices. We are the next family and the next and the next. We are everyone who walked here and learned what waits. We are what you will become." The dark shapes began descending from the trees with movements that defied gravity, flowing downward like liquid shadow rather than flying or climbing. As they drew closer, I could see details that confirmed my worst fears. Fragments of clothing fused with alien anatomy, glimpses of what might once have been human faces stretched and distorted beyond recognition, appendages that suggested arms and legs reshaped into something designed for a different kind of existence. I ran. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I crashed through the undergrowth with reckless abandon, no longer caring about direction or destination, focused only on putting distance between myself and the clearing where nightmares had taken physical form. Behind me, I could hear the sound of pursuit, not the rustle of normal creatures moving through forest, but something like wind passing through hollow spaces, accompanied by voices that continued their chant, even as they gave chase. Branches tore at my clothing and skin, drawing blood that I barely noticed in my desperation to escape. I vaulted fallen logs and crashed through thickets that would normally have required careful navigation, driven by the absolute certainty that stopping meant joining the collection of transformed souls that had shown me their true nature. The voices followed, growing closer with each passing moment. They seemed to come from the trees themselves now, as if the entire forest had become part of the entity that sought to claim me. The familiar bird calls mixed with human words in a cacophony of sound that threatened to overwhelm my sanity entirely. Just when I thought my strength would fail, when my lungs could no longer process the thick air and my legs could no longer support my weight, I burst through a final line of trees and found myself standing on the dirt road. The transition was so abrupt and complete that I nearly fell from the shock of it. One moment I was trapped in an endless maze of identical trees under perpetual twilight, and the next I stood on the familiar packed earth of the path I had walked countless times before. Afternoon sunlight, bright and warm and absolutely normal, streamed down from a clear sky overhead. Ranger was exactly where I had left him, sitting patiently at the spot where I had commanded him to stay. His tail began wagging the moment he saw me, and he jumped up with the enthusiastic greeting of a dog whose human had been gone for longer than expected. There was no indication that he had heard the pursuit crashing through the woods behind me, no sign that anything unusual had occurred. I turned to look back at the tree line, expecting to see dark shapes emerging in pursuit, or at least some evidence of the disturbance I had created during my frantic escape. Instead, I found myself staring at a perfectly normal stretch of New England forest. Sunlight filtered peacefully through the leaves. Birds, normal birds, chirped in the branches, and a slight breeze rustled the foliage with gentle, natural sounds. No sign of pursuit, no dark shapes, no voices. My watch was working again, showing that only 40 minutes had passed since we had begun our walk. According to the display, I'd been gone from the road for less than 20 minutes, though the experience had felt like hours of navigation through an impossible landscape. I looked down at myself, expecting to find my clothing torn and bloodied from the desperate flight through the underbrush. Instead, my jacket showed only minor scuffs, and the scratches on my hands were superficial, nothing that couldn't have resulted from a casual walk through light brush. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was my state of absolute terror and the metallic taste of adrenaline that flooded my mouth. My heart still pounded with the rhythm of fear, and my hands shook as I reached for Ranger's leash. We walked home in silence, Ranger trotting alongside me with his usual contentment while I struggled to process what had happened. The familiar sights of our route, the stone walls, the old foundations, the abandoned house, now carried sinister implications that I could never again ignore. At home, I immediately began researching the history of the area. Property records, census data, local newspaper archives, anything that might provide information about the families and workers who had once lived along our walking route. What I found confirmed the story the voices had told me in the clearing. The mill had been abandoned suddenly in 1824, its workers and their families simply disappearing without explanation. The old house had been occupied by a series of families, each staying for only a few years before vanishing entirely, leaving behind all their possessions. The last recorded residents had disappeared in 1967, and since then, no one had remained in the area for more than a few months. I never walked that road again. 10 years have passed since that October afternoon, and I still live in the same house, though I've found new routes for my daily walks with Ranger's successor, a golden retriever named Scout. The dirt road remains visible from my windows, and sometimes, especially in the late afternoon when the light creates deep shadows under the trees, I think I can hear faint sounds coming from the woods. Bird calls. Always bird calls. Occasionally, I see other people walking that road, new residents of the area, hikers exploring the rural paths, families out for an afternoon stroll. I've considered warning them, but what would I say? That the woods are inhabited by transformed souls of missing persons. That bird calls can lead you into a place that exists outside normal geography and time. They would think I was insane. Perhaps I am. But sometimes, in the evening quiet, I hear the calls again. The same warbling trill, the same staccato clicks, the same impossible echo on the final whistle. They come from the direction of the old road, faint but unmistakable, carrying on the wind like a message intended specifically for me. They're still there, still waiting, still calling to anyone who might be curious enough to investigate. And sometimes, God help me, I feel the urge to walk out my front door, cross the field, and follow those calls once more into the woods that remember everyone who enters them. The only thing that stops me is the knowledge that this time, I might not find my way back to the road. Or perhaps, more terrifying still, I might not want to. September 15th, 2023. I was 29 years old when my life changed in ways I still struggle to articulate. What began as an innocent weekend camping trip transformed into something I cannot fully explain, even now, months later, as I attempt to document these events. The invitation came on a Tuesday afternoon. My phone buzzed with a message from an old college friend suggesting we gather a small group for an autumn camping trip in the Appalachian wilderness. I hadn't ventured into those remote woods for nearly 3 years, not since our last excursion when we'd sworn to make it an annual tradition. Life, as it often does, had intervened. New jobs, relocations, relationships. The suggestion struck me as exactly what I needed after months of grinding away at my desk job. "Count me in," I replied, surprised by my own enthusiasm. Within hours, our group chat swelled with confirmations. We would be 6 in total, all friends from university days, now scattered across different careers but bound by those formative years. The plan crystallized quickly. We would meet at my friend's rural property that bordered the state forest, venture in on four-wheelers towing supply wagons, and spend 2 nights at a secluded clearing approximately 7 miles from the nearest marked trail. As the weekend approached, I found myself checking weather forecasts obsessively. A storm system threatened to derail our plans, but forecasters predicted it would clear by Friday morning, leaving behind only dampness and fog. Perfect atmosphere for campfire stories, I thought, not yet understanding how inappropriate that sentiment would prove to be. Thursday night I packed methodically. Thermal layers, waterproof boots, first aid supplies, more batteries than seemed reasonable. Something urged me toward excessive preparation. I dismissed it as excitement, perhaps mixed with the natural caution that comes with age. At 29, I was no longer the reckless college student who once thought himself invincible. I understood the wilderness demanded respect. Sleep came fitfully that night. Rain lashed against my bedroom window as thunder rolled across the sky. I lay awake, listening to the storm's intensity, wondering if this was nature's warning, one I was too obtuse to heed. Friday morning arrived with eerie stillness. The storm had exhausted itself overnight, leaving behind a world drenched and glistening. I loaded my gear into my car and headed toward my friend's property, watching fog curl through valleys as I navigated winding country roads. Arriving at the meeting point felt oddly anticlimactic. My friends were already there, moving with unusual quietness as they transferred equipment to the four-wheelers. Our typical boisterous greetings were replaced by subdued nods and half-hearted smiles. I attributed this to the early hour and lingering drowsiness. "Strange weather," remarked one friend, glancing toward the tree line where mist clung to branches like ghostly fingers. "Forecast says it'll burn off by noon." We finished loading in near silence. 2 four-wheelers, each pulling a wagon laden with supplies, tents, food, water, equipment. Everything secured with bungee cords that seemed inadequate for the journey ahead. Without discussion, we mounted up and began our trek into the forest. The first mile passed uneventfully. Muddy trails forced careful navigation, our vehicles occasionally sliding in saturated earth. The forest around us remained unnaturally quiet. No birdsong accompanied our journey. No rustling indicated wildlife retreating from our intrusion. Only the mechanical growl of engines disturbed the silence. "Is it always this quiet after a storm?" I called to my friend driving ahead. He shrugged without turning back. Animals probably seeking higher ground. That rain was something else. 2 miles in, we paused at a fallen tree blocking our planned route. While discussing alternative paths, I noticed how everyone's eyes kept darting toward the surrounding woods. The dense undergrowth created countless shadowed recesses where imagination could place unwelcome observers. "We should take the eastern fork," suggested our unofficial guide, pointing to a barely visible trail. "It's longer but passable. This tree isn't moving anytime soon." The detour led us deeper into unfamiliar territory. Branches hung lower here, scraping against shoulders and helmets. Visibility decreased as the canopy thickened overhead. Despite the morning hour, twilight conditions prevailed. 4 miles from our starting point, we reached a shallow creek crossing. Water rushed over smooth stones, higher than expected from the overnight downpour. As we carefully navigated across, I glimpsed movement on the opposite bank, something tall and thin withdrawing into dense foliage. "Did you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the spot. My friends followed my gesture, but saw nothing. The moment passed, dismissed as a trick of light filtered through swaying branches. We continued onward. By midday, the predicted clearing of weather hadn't materialized. Instead, fog persisted, accompanied by a temperature drop that penetrated layers of clothing. Our progress slowed as trails deteriorated into nearly impassable mud pits. The journey, initially estimated at 2 hours, stretched into 4. No one suggested turning back. We reached the clearing shortly after 3 in the afternoon, though the forest's dim light made it feel much later. Our intended campsite had transformed into an island of relatively dry ground surrounded by sodden earth. Trees encircled the area completely, their highest branches intertwining to create a natural ceiling that would normally seem charming. Today, it felt confining. "We should get tents up before it gets any darker," someone suggested, breaking our collective trance. Activity dispelled some of the unease that had accumulated during our journey. We divided tasks efficiently, clearing ground, unpacking equipment, gathering firewood from the surrounding area. Working in pairs provided comfort against the oppressive silence that continued to dominate the forest. My partner and I ventured slightly beyond the clearing's edge to collect kindling. 50 yards from camp, we discovered an unusual arrangement of stones. Not quite a circle, more an irregular polygon, with each stone approximately the same size and partially embedded in soil. "Old campfire?" I suggested, though nothing about the formation resembled any fire pit I'd ever seen. "Maybe," my friend replied, clearly unconvinced. "Let's get back." Upon returning to camp, neither of us mentioned our discovery. The daylight continued its premature retreat as we worked to establish our temporary home. Tents rose along the clearing's perimeter, facing inward toward where our fire would burn. The arrangement felt instinctively defensive. As I secured my tent stakes, a sensation of being observed intensified. Repeatedly, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to find someone, or something, at the forest's edge. Each time I saw only trees, undergrowth, and deepening shadows. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger as afternoon surrendered to evening. "Fire's finally catching," announced our designated cook, drawing everyone's attention to the center of our encampment. Flames illuminated faces with flickering orange light, revealing expressions that mirrored my own discomfort. No one spoke of it directly, but our typical camping banter remained conspicuously absent. Instead, conversation focused exclusively on practicalities, meal preparation, sleeping arrangements, weather prospects. As darkness claimed the forest completely, our fire became an island of light in an ocean of impenetrable black. Beyond its radius, nothing remained visible. Sound, too, seemed altered by nightfall. The crack of burning wood echoed strangely, while voices felt muffled, as though the darkness itself absorbed our words. Dinner concluded without ceremony. We huddled closer to the flames, drawing what comfort we could from their warmth and light. No one suggested ghost stories or other traditional camping entertainment. Instead, we discussed watch rotations with unusual seriousness. 2-hour shifts, pairs of 2, proposed our most experienced outdoorsman. No one goes anywhere alone, not even to relieve themselves. No one questioned these precautions. No one asked what threat justified such vigilance. Some knowledge requires no articulation to be universally understood. My watch assignment came during the deepest hours, 2 to 4 a.m. I retreated to my tent around 10, hoping to accumulate enough rest before my shift. Inside the thin nylon walls, isolation intensified every sensation. The whispering rustle of trees outside, the occasional snap of twigs from indeterminate distances, the gradual diminishing of voices as others sought sleep. Rest proved impossible. I lay on my sleeping bag, fully clothed including boots, staring at the tent ceiling where shadows from our diminishing fire performed unsettling dances. Time stretched elastically, minutes expanding into what felt like hours. At 1:45 a.m., a soft voice called my name from outside. My watch partner had arrived to collect me. I emerged into a drastically altered world. The fire had reduced to embers that cast minimal light. Cloud cover obscured stars and moon. The darkness pressed inward with tangible weight. "Anything happened during your shift?" I whispered to the friend I was relieving. "Nothing specific," came the careful reply. "But listen to the forest." I did, focusing beyond the immediate sounds of our camp. The absence struck me immediately. No insects chirping, no nocturnal birds calling, no small creatures moving through underbrush. Complete stillness prevailed, as though the entire ecosystem had evacuated, leaving only empty landscape behind. My watch partner and I positioned ourselves on opposite sides of the dying fire, facing outward toward the encroaching darkness. We maintained this arrangement for nearly an hour, speaking occasionally in hushed tones that seemed thunderous against the background silence. At approximately 3:10 a.m., the first distinct sound emerged from the forest's depths, a single sharp crack like a substantial branch breaking underfoot. Both our heads snapped toward the source, straining to penetrate darkness that remained absolute. "Could be anything," my partner reasoned. "Falling deadwood. Deer." Neither of us believed these explanations. 10 minutes later, another sound, closer this time. A rustling movement, prolonged rather than instantaneous, suggesting deliberate progress through undergrowth. My hand found the heavy flashlight beside me, fingers tightening around its metal body. "Should we wake the others?" I breathed. "Not yet. Could still be wildlife." The third sound eliminated all ambiguity. A low, sustained exhalation, distinctly breath-like but distorted somehow, as though passing through an unusual structure. It originated from the forest edge directly behind my tent, no more than 20 feet distant. My partner raised their flashlight, directing its beam toward the sound's origin. I mirrored the action. Twin beams cut through darkness to illuminate. Nothing. Empty space between tree trunks, undisturbed foliage, complete absence where presence had been unmistakably indicated. We maintained our lights on that spot for several minutes, neither speaking nor moving. Eventually, my partner whispered, "I'm waking everyone. Something's wrong here." Within minutes, our entire group huddled around the hastily replenished fire. No one questioned the decision to abandon sleep. No one suggested overreaction. Each face displayed the same recognition. We had intruded where we were not welcome. The remainder of the night passed in tense vigilance. Occasional sounds continued to emanate from the surrounding forest, always from different directions, always retreating before illumination could capture their source. We discussed departure but concluded that attempting to navigate the treacherous trails in darkness presented greater danger than remaining until daylight. None of us acknowledged the most disturbing aspect of our situation. The sense that whatever circled our camp was not merely observing, but evaluating, assessing, planning. First light arrived with excruciating slowness, gradient rather than decisive. Fog had returned overnight, shrouding the forest in diffuse gray that transformed solid objects into spectral approximations of themselves. Trees 30 feet distant appeared as vague silhouettes, their details lost in misty obscuration. Exhaustion had claimed most of my companions, who dozed in uncomfortable positions around the fire's remnants. I had remained wakeful, watching the darkness gradually dilute into murky half-light. With morning's arrival, I felt compelled to investigate our surroundings in daylight conditions, hoping rational observation might dispel night terrors. I woke my closest friend, explaining my intention to survey the campsite perimeter. Together we ventured toward the forest edge, maintaining sight of our sleeping companions. The ground revealed immediate abnormalities. Depressions in the soft earth surrounding our clearing, roughly oval in shape and approximately 18 inches in length. "These weren't here yesterday," my friend noted, crouching to examine one such impression. "And they're all around us." Indeed, similar depressions encircled our entire campsite at irregular intervals. Some appeared shallow, others pressed deep into mud. None resembled any animal track I recognized. Most disturbing was their arrangement, all facing inward toward our camp, as though something had stood at the forest's edge, observing from multiple positions throughout the night. Our examination continued beyond this initial discovery. 20 yards into the woods, we found tree bark stripped at approximately 7 feet above ground level, far higher than deer or other typical forest inhabitants could reach. The exposed wood appeared freshly damaged, with moisture still beading on its surface. Could be bear activity, my friend suggested without conviction. Bears don't leave marks this precise, I countered, noting the methodical nature of the stripping. And they don't stand still to watch humans sleep. Further exploration revealed additional anomalies. A small stream running near our campsite contained several stones arranged in patterns inconsistent with natural water flow, deliberate placements forming crude geometric shapes. Nearby, we discovered an animal carcass, a medium-sized raccoon, with wounds defying explanation. The creature appeared completely drained of blood, yet no significant external injuries were visible except for 2 small punctures at the base of its skull. We returned to camp as others began stirring, sharing our discoveries in hushed conferences rather than group announcement. Unspoken consensus formed. We would depart immediately after breakfast, cutting our planned 2-night excursion to a single traumatic experience. Equipment failures happen, someone rationalized as we dismantled tents with unusual haste. Weather turns dangerous. No shame in adapting plans. These pretexts allowed us to maintain some facade of dignity. None admitted fleeing from threats we couldn't articulate or explain. None suggested supernatural intervention in what must surely have rational explanation. Yet our actions, the frantic packing, constant visual scanning of surroundings, rigid insistence on maintaining group proximity, betrayed our genuine understanding. Something had stalked our camp throughout the night. Something continued watching as we prepared for departure. Something waited for opportunities we were determined not to provide. Preparation for departure progressed with artificial normalcy. We consumed cold breakfast rations while systematically dismantling our brief occupation of the clearing. Conversation remained minimal, focused exclusively on immediate tasks. The persistent fog enhanced our isolation, creating the impression that our small group might be the last humans in existence. As I collapsed my tent, a distinct awareness crystallized. The forest's unnatural silence had evolved into something more insidious. Background sounds had returned, but with subtle wrongness. Bird calls lacked proper cadence, seeming mechanical rather than organic. Wind through branches produced tones that approximated whispers. The entire auditory landscape felt performative rather than genuine. "Does anyone else notice the sounds?" I asked, interrupting the methodical breakdown of camp. 5 faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from confusion to alarmed recognition. One friend cocked their head, listening intently before responding. "They don't match the birds," they observed. "The calls. They're not right for these species." Another added, "And they're not coming from the trees. They sound like they're coming from the ground." This observation, once articulated, became impossible to unhear. The mimicry of natural forest sounds originated from ground level rather than appropriate heights. Whatever produced these imitations lacked accurate understanding of the source material, creating approximate rather than precise replications. Our departure preparations accelerated to barely controlled panic. Equipment was secured haphazardly to the 4-wheelers and wagons. Personal belongings were abandoned if not immediately accessible. The pretense of normal expedition conclusion evaporated entirely. As we prepared to mount our vehicles, one friend suddenly froze, staring intently at the ground near our extinguished fire pit. Wordlessly, he pointed toward an indentation in the ash-mixed soil. We gathered around the discovery, understanding its significance instantly. A footprint, if such inadequate terminology could apply. The impression measured nearly 20 inches in length, but with disturbing narrowness. No distinct toe markings appeared, only an elongated shape tapering to points at both ends. Most alarmingly, the impression's depth indicated enormous weight distribution along its unusual form. "That wasn't there earlier," someone whispered unnecessarily. "It's fresh," confirmed another. "The edges are still settling." This evidence of immediate proximity shattered remaining composure. We abandoned final preparations and mounted our vehicles with frantic urgency. Engines roared to life, shattering the forest's fabricated soundscape. As we prepared to depart, a final observation penetrated my awareness. The fog had developed structure inconsistent with natural meteorological patterns. Rather than uniform diffusion, it now presented concentrated cylindrical formations at regular intervals throughout the surrounding forest. These vertical fog columns held position despite air movement that should have dispersed them. Each maintained approximately human height, but with disproportionate thinness. Each remained absolutely motionless, despite the engine vibrations disturbing nearby vegetation. Each appeared to be watching our departure. I said nothing of this observation, fearing verbalization might trigger collective hysteria. Instead, I focused on the immediate task, guiding my four-wheeler back along the treacherous trail towards safety. We formed a tight procession, abandoning single-file protocol in favor of close proximity that sacrificed maneuverability for perceived security. The journey outward commenced with desperate optimism that would prove tragically unfounded. Our escape began with mechanical determination, engines straining against mud that seemed substantially deeper than during our inward journey. The lead four-wheeler established our route, retracing original trails where possible despite deteriorated conditions. Fog continued to limit visibility to approximately 15 feet, transforming navigation into near-blind pursuit of the vehicle immediately ahead. Progress proved agonizingly slow. Twice within the first mile, wagons became mired in concealed depressions, requiring group effort to extract them. During these stops, the forest's artificial soundscape intensified, bird calls increasing in volume but decreasing in accuracy, creating cacophonous parody of natural ambience. More disturbing were the glimpsed movements in peripheral vision. Tall, thin shapes that retreated before direct observation could confirm their presence. These manifestations occurred with increasing frequency as our journey progressed, always maintaining distance that precluded clear identification. Halfway through our planned route, disaster struck. The lead four-wheeler's engine sputtered and died while crossing a shallow creek. Water had infiltrated critical components, rendering the vehicle temporarily inoperable. Basic repairs might restore function, but required time we instinctively understood was unavailable. We double up on the remaining four-wheeler, decided our most practical companion. Abandon non-essential equipment. We need to maintain movement. This solution required significant sacrifice. Personal gear, camping equipment, even food supplies were consolidated to absolute minimums. The remaining four-wheeler would carry all 6 of us, 3 on the vehicle itself, 3 precariously positioned on the attached wagon. Weight distribution became critical conversation rather than the looming threat motivating our desperate arrangements. As we completed these adjustments, I noticed the fog columns had reduced their perimeter. Where they had previously maintained substantial distance, they now formed a loose circle approximately 50 yards from our position. Their formation suggested coordinated rather than random distribution. Their presence implied intelligence governing their arrangement. "We need to move now," I urged, interrupting debate about optimal seating arrangements. "Right now." Something in my tone silenced further discussion. We mounted our overloaded vehicle without additional deliberation. The engine protested against excessive burden, but maintained operation as we resumed our retreat from the increasingly hostile environment. Progress degraded further under these compromised conditions. Our speed reduced to walking pace in many sections, as the four-wheeler struggled against combined weight and adverse terrain. The fog thickened around us, limiting visibility to mere feet and forcing near-blind navigation. Most concerning, temperatures dropped precipitously despite midday timing, transforming exhaled breath into visible vapor. 3 miles from safety, we encountered our most significant obstacle: a massive tree fallen directly across our path, too substantial to circumvent through dense surrounding growth. This barrier had not existed during our inward journey, its fresh condition evident from still attached green leaves and unweathered exposed wood at the breakpoint. Could the storm have weakened it? Someone suggested, voice quavering. Examination revealed the disturbing truth. This tree had not fallen naturally. Its trunk displayed clear evidence of deliberate damage. Deep gouges penetrated the wood in methodical patterns, weakening the structure until collapse became inevitable. These markings resembled those we had observed on standing trees near our campsite, but executed with greater intensity and purpose. "We go around," decided our driver. "Backtrack to the last fork and take the eastern path." This alternative would extend our journey significantly, but offered our only viable option. As we prepared to reverse direction, a sound penetrated the fog. Rhythmic impacts suggesting bipedal movement, approaching rapidly from multiple directions. The noise surrounded our position completely, indicating coordinated convergence rather than random approach. "Get on now!" screamed our driver, gunning the engine before everyone had fully secured positions. We accelerated backward with dangerous speed, abandoning equipment that fell from our overloaded wagon. Bodies pressed together in desperate configuration as the four-wheeler fishtailed through mud. Multiple impacts against unseen obstacles threatened to overturn our vehicle, but somehow we maintained forward progress away from the blocked trail. The pursuing sounds maintained pace with our retreat, neither gaining nor losing distance despite our erratic movement. Their consistent rhythm suggested tireless pursuit unburdened by terrain limitations that hampered our mechanical escape. Reaching the previous trail fork, we executed a hazardous turn onto the eastern path, a route none of us had previously traveled. This trail ascended sharply, climbing terrain features that challenged our overloaded vehicle's capabilities. The engine temperature gauge rose alarmingly as we forced continued progress up the incline. "It should connect with the logging road," gasped our navigator between violent jolts. "Half-mile ahead." Whether this assessment proved accurate, we never discovered. 200 yards along this unfamiliar path, we encountered evidence that froze my blood. Multiple trees marked with the same gouging patterns we had observed throughout our ordeal. These markings formed crude arrows pointing back toward our campsite, suggesting territorial boundaries deliberately indicated. We had not escaped the threat. We had penetrated deeper into its domain. What followed exists in my memory as fragmented impressions rather than coherent narrative. The four-wheeler engine screaming in protest as we reversed direction again. Bodies clinging to each other as the vehicle slid down muddy inclines at uncontrollable speed. Fog swirling around us in patterns that defied natural air movement, forming momentary apertures that revealed glimpses of something keeping pace alongside our desperate flight. "The main trail!" someone shouted above mechanical noise. "We have to reach the main trail!" This objective represented our only hope. The established path wide enough for forestry vehicles, maintained sufficiently to permit rapid travel. If we could reach this artery, perhaps speed might accomplish what stealth and caution had failed to provide. Our driver abandoned caution entirely, pushing our vehicle beyond reasonable safety limitations. Twice we nearly overturned navigating sharp corners. Once the wagon briefly separated from its hitch before slamming back into connection. Throughout this chaotic retreat, the pursuing sounds maintained consistent proximity, neither closing the distance nor falling behind despite our increasingly reckless pace. Miraculously, we identified junction markings indicating the main trail's approach. Hope surged momentarily as we rounded a final bend to discover the wider path stretching before us. This triumph proved short-lived. Across the main trail, at regular intervals extending in both directions, stood the fog columns we had observed throughout our ordeal. No longer maintaining distance, they now formed an unmistakable blockade across our escape route. In daylight, their structure became horrifyingly apparent. These were not meteorological phenomena, but physical entities using atmospheric conditions as partial concealment. Their forms defied rational description. Proportions suggested vague humanoid configuration, but with impossible dimensions. Height exceeding 7 feet, width narrower than anatomically viable, limbs articulated at joints inconsistent with mammalian structure. Their surfaces absorbed rather than reflected available light, creating void-like silhouettes against the forest backdrop. Most disturbing was their absolute stillness as our vehicle approached. No defensive posturing, no retreat from potential collision. They maintained position with complete confidence in their ability to halt our progress through means beyond physical interception. Our driver made the only possible decision. With wordless determination, he accelerated directly toward the center of their formation, aiming for the widest gap between entities. The four-wheeler's engine shrieked under strain as we charged the blockade at maximum achievable speed. The temperature plummeted as we entered their formation. Condensation instantly froze on exposed metal surfaces. Breath crystallized upon exhalation. Most alarmingly, the engine note changed, deepening, slowing, as though mechanical operations were being systematically impeded by proximity to these entities. We should have faltered there. By all rational expectation, our vehicle should have stalled within their formation, leaving us stranded among these impossible figures. What preserved our momentum remains unexplainable. Perhaps momentum itself, perhaps some limitation to their influence, perhaps intervention from forces I hesitate to name. The four-wheeler burst through their line with final desperate surge. Engine function normalized immediately upon clearing their proximity. Temperature gradually increased as distance grew between our position and their blockade. The pursuing sounds diminished for the first time since their commencement, suggesting territorial boundaries beyond which pursuit would not continue. We maintained maximum speed along the main trail, heedless of physical discomfort from overcrowding and violent motion. No one spoke. No one looked backward. Our collective focus narrowed exclusively to the path ahead and increasing distance from the nightmare behind. Civilization reappeared with shocking abruptness, first as maintained property boundaries, then as scattered rural structures, finally as the familiar driveway leading to my friend's property, where our journey had begun mere hours earlier. We arrived with vehicle nearly depleted of fuel, bodies battered from rough passage, minds fragmented by experiences defying rational categorization. We unloaded in silence, each processing individual interpretations of our shared ordeal. Equipment transfers occurred mechanically, without discussion of items abandoned during our retreat. Departure arrangements manifested without explicit coordination, each person gravitating toward their vehicle with unspoken urgency to separate, to return to environments where natural laws maintained reliable governance. No collective debriefing occurred that day, nor in subsequent communications. References to our experience emerged obliquely in later conversations, always couched in ambiguous terminology that avoided direct acknowledgement. That weekend in September became our shorthand designation, requiring no additional specification. Months have passed since our encounter. I have researched historical documentation of the region, discovering disturbing patterns in disappearances dating back to early settlement periods. Local folklore contains veiled references to entities matching our observations, though described through metaphorical frameworks reflecting each era's cultural context. I write this account not expecting validation or explanation. I document these events because silence grants greater power to experiences that thrive in absence of articulation. Whatever we encountered in those woods continues its existence regardless of our witness. Its territorial boundaries remain unmarked on conventional maps, but are no less real for their official absence. I no longer venture into forests. I avoid locations where tree cover obstructs clear sightline to the horizon. I maintain lighting at night beyond reasonable necessity. These adaptations represent rational response to knowledge once gained cannot be unlearned. That wilderness contains more than ecological systems and natural predators. It contains watchers whose purposes remain their own. The first time I heard the sound, I was setting up camp in a remote section of Yellowstone National Park. A whisper that didn't belong among the natural forest sounds, something between a human voice and the wind through hollow bones. I dismissed it as exhaustion from the long hike. 3 days into a 2-week solo photography expedition documenting wildlife in the park's northern range, I hadn't expected company. My name is Michael Thompson. I've been a park ranger at Yellowstone for 15 years, though this trip was purely personal. After a decade and a half of watching tourists marvel at Old Faithful and warning them not to feed the bears, I thought I knew every inch of this wilderness. I was wrong. That night, I awoke to frost on the inside of my tent. Strange, given it was mid-June. The temperature gauge on my watch read 28 degrees, a sudden, inexplicable drop. Outside, the moonlight cast long shadows across the clearing where I'd made camp. The trees seemed to bend inward, their silhouettes forming a circle around my small sanctuary of nylon and aluminum. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal, of course. That's when I noticed the footprints in the thin layer of frost outside my tent. Human-sized but elongated, with strange indentations where toes should be. They circled my tent completely, then vanished into the tree line. Something rustled in the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness to reveal nothing. Just swaying branches and dancing shadows. But the unshakable feeling of being watched persisted. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast wilderness. "Anyone there?" Only silence answered. Then faintly, what sounded like my own voice echoed back. "Anyone there?" Sleep didn't come easily after that. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a confused elk. Wildlife behaves strangely sometimes, especially around human encampments. But 15 years of ranger experience told me this was different. The next morning, the frost was gone, the temperature back to a reasonable 65 degrees. In the light of day, the footprints had vanished without a trace, making me question if I'd imagined the whole thing. I packed my gear and continued my planned route, pushing the experience to the back of my mind. Around midday, I stopped at a small stream to refill my water bottles. That's when I noticed the strange markings on a nearby tree. 3 deep gouges running vertically up the trunk. Too high and too precise to be from a bear. They looked fresh, the inner wood still light-colored and oozing sap. As I approached the tree, a putrid smell hit me, like rotting meat mixed with wet soil. I'd smelled death before in the park, usually elk or deer taken down by wolves. This was similar, but wrong somehow. Unnatural. I took photographs of the markings, then continued hiking, but found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. The forest had gone quiet. No bird song, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. In my years as a ranger, I'd learned to read the wilderness. When it falls silent, something is very wrong. By late afternoon, I reached my destination, a small valley known for its elk herds and occasional wolf sightings. But the valley was empty. No wildlife, not even insects. I set up camp on a ridge overlooking the area, hoping the elevated position would give me some security. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, I tried to convince myself that everything was normal. Wildlife patterns change. Animals migrate. Nothing to worry about. Until I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line below. Too tall and thin to be human, yet standing on 2 legs. It remained motionless. staring up at my camp. Even from this distance, I could feel its gaze boring into me. I fumbled for my camera with its telephoto lens, but by the time I focused, the figure was gone. The photograph showed only empty space where I was certain something had stood. That night, the temperature dropped again. Ice crystals formed on my tent fly as the thermometer plunged below freezing. And somewhere in the darkness, I heard it again, my own voice calling my name. Michael. Michael Thompson. No one else on this trip knew my full name. Sleep was impossible now. I sat awake, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other, waiting for dawn. And as the first light broke over the eastern ridge, I made a decision. I needed to find out what was happening. Little did I know that my curiosity would lead me into the darkest legend of Yellowstone, a nightmare the native tribes had whispered about for centuries, a hunger that never dies, a horror known as the Wendigo. The fourth day dawned with an unexpected radio call. My satellite phone, which I'd brought for emergencies, buzzed with static before a familiar voice broke through. "Thompson, you there? It's Sarah Johnson." Sarah was one of the newer rangers, a brilliant ecologist with a passion for wildlife conservation. I'd trained her myself when she arrived last year. "I'm here," I replied, surprised. "What's going on?" "We've got a situation. Family of 4, the Martins, missed their check-in yesterday. Last seen heading into your area 3 days ago. Search parties being organized, but you're closest." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Send me their last known coordinates." As the details came through, I realized the Martins' planned route would have taken them directly through the valley I was overlooking, the same one that had been unnaturally empty of wildlife. "I'll start looking," I told Sarah. "Keep me posted on the search team's ETA." "Will do. And Mike?" "Jack Whitecloud insisted on joining the search. Says there's something important you should know." Jack was an elder from one of the local tribes who occasionally worked as a guide for the park. If he was concerned enough to join a search party, something serious was happening. "Tell him I'll meet them at Junction Creek by sundown." After gathering my gear, I descended into the valley, following what should have been the Martins' trail. The silence was even more oppressive now. No wind, no bird song, not even the buzz of insects. Just my footsteps and breathing, both of which seemed too loud in the stillness. About 2 miles in, I found their campsite, or what remained of it. The tent was still standing, but had been torn open from the inside. Sleeping bags lay scattered, one still containing a child's stuffed animal. A family-sized backpack leaned against a tree, containing water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit. All the essentials no one would willingly leave behind. But it was the ground that told the most disturbing story. Deep furrows ran through the campsite, as if someone, or something, had been dragged away. Multiple sets of footprints overlapped in chaotic patterns. Small ones belonging to children running, adult-sized ones in pursuit, and among them, those same elongated prints I'd seen around my own tent. The temperature around the campsite was noticeably colder than the surrounding forest. My breath fogged in the air as I examined a strange substance on the tree trunks. A black, viscous residue that smelled of rot and something else. Something chemical and wrong. I documented everything, taking photographs and GPS coordinates. As I worked, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly turning, expecting to see someone or something behind me. That's when I heard it. A child's voice, faint but clear. "Mommy? Where are you?" It came from deeper in the forest, away from the trail. Everything in my training told me to wait for backup, but if one of the Martin children was still alive out there... "Hello?" I called out. "National Park Service. Is someone there?" Silence then. "Help me, please. I'm scared." The voice seemed to shift location, now coming from my left. I turned toward it, stepping carefully through the underbrush. "Keep talking. I'll find you." This way. Please hurry. The voice led me deeper into the forest, away from the trail and campsite. Something felt wrong. The voice remained the same distance away no matter how quickly I moved. Still, I pushed forward, hoping to find a lost, frightened child. After 10 minutes of following the voice, I realized I'd been led in a complete circle, ending up back at the destroyed campsite. But now, something was different. My backpack, which I'd left propped against a tree, was gone. A cold realization washed over me. I was being hunted. I drew my knife and bear spray, backing slowly toward the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching like gnarled fingers. From every direction, I began to hear whispers, fragments of voices, some sounding like the Martin family, others like my fellow rangers, all calling for help. Breaking into a run, I sprinted back toward the main trail, no longer caring about tracking or evidence. Behind me, something crashed through the underbrush, something fast and large that moved with unnatural speed. I reached Junction Creek just as the sun began to set, finding Sarah Johnson and a small search party setting up a base camp. Jack White Cloud stood apart from the others, his weathered face grave as he watched me emerge from the tree line. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked quietly as I approached, gasping for breath. "Seen what?" I managed between gulps of air. "The hunger that walks, the Wendigo." His eyes, dark and knowing, held mine. "It's woken again." The search party gathered around the campfire that night, flames casting long shadows across concerned faces. Besides Sarah and Jack, there were 2 other rangers I knew well, Rodriguez and Chen, plus a local search and rescue volunteer named Mackenzie. Everyone listened intently as I described what I'd found at the Martins' campsite. "We should call in more resources," Sarah suggested. "Maybe the FBI." "No," Jack interrupted, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. "More people will only mean more victims." I'd known Jack Whitecloud for nearly a decade. He rarely spoke so definitively, especially when it came to park operations. The others turned to him with varying expressions of skepticism and curiosity. "You mentioned a Wendigo," I prompted. Jack nodded slowly, the firelight deepening the lines in his face. "My people have known about this creature for centuries. It was once human, but transformed by the ultimate taboo, consuming human flesh. Now it hungers eternally, growing stronger with each victim but never satisfied." Rodriguez rolled his eyes slightly. "With all respect, Jack, we need to focus on finding this family, not on folklore." "It's not just folklore," I said, surprising myself. "Something's out there, something that can imitate voices, create unnatural cold, something predatory and intelligent." Jack reached into his pack and pulled out a worn leather journal. "My grandfather was a guide in these mountains. He recorded his encounters and the stories passed down through generations." He opened the journal to reveal intricate drawings, a gaunt, skeletal figure with a deer's skull for a head, unnaturally long limbs, and clawed hands. The details matched what I'd glimpsed at the edge of the valley. "The Wendigo grows stronger in winter, but can manifest any time hunger and desperation take hold," Jack explained. "It corrupts the land around it. Animals flee, plants wither. It leaves a trail of cold and silence." Sarah leaned forward. And I'm not saying I believe this, but if this thing exists, how do we fight it?" "You don't," Jack said grimly. "You survive it. The Wendigo cannot be killed by conventional means. It can be wounded, temporarily driven away, but ultimately it must be trapped." He turned pages in the journal, showing ancient symbols and what appeared to be ritual instructions. "There's a cave system about 5 miles north of here. According to my grandfather, it was used centuries ago to trap a Wendigo during a particularly harsh winter. The cave walls are marked with protective symbols." Chen, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. So what's the plan? We just lure this thing into a cave and hope some old drawings keep it there? Jack fixed him with a steady gaze. Do you have a better suggestion? Yeah, find the family and get everyone the hell out of these woods. And if they're already dead? I asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Then we find whatever killed them, Rodriguez said firmly. And if they're not dead? Sarah added. If they're out there somewhere, injured or lost? Jack closed his journal. The Wendigo often keeps victims alive, especially in warmer months when its powers are weaker. It feeds on fear as much as flesh. A chill ran through the group. The implications were clear. The Martin family might still be alive, but in a situation too horrific to contemplate. We need to split up, I decided. Sarah and I will investigate the cave system Jack mentioned. If there's any truth to this, we need to know our options. Rodriguez, Chen, and Mackenzie continue searching for the Martins along their planned route. Splitting up is exactly what it wants, Jack warned. We don't have a choice, I countered. Every hour decreases the chances of finding survivors. As we set watch rotations for the night, Jack pulled me aside. There's something else you should know, he said quietly. The Wendigo doesn't just hunt randomly. It's drawn to certain people, those with darkness in their past or secrets in their hearts. What are you saying? I'm saying be careful what you think about out there. The Wendigo can sense guilt, regret, desire. It will use it against you. I wanted to dismiss his warning, but the memory of hearing my own name called in the darkness made me hesitate. I'll keep that in mind, I promised. That night, the temperature dropped again, frost forming on our tents despite the summer season. I took the first watch, staring into the darkness beyond our camp. Twice, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a tall, thin silhouette watching our camp. But when I shined my flashlight, nothing was there. Around 2 a.m., Sarah woke for her shift. As I was about to enter my tent, she grabbed my arm. Mike, look. She pointed to the ground around our camp. In the dirt, barely visible in the firelight, was a circle of those same elongated footprints surrounding our entire campsite. They hadn't been there an hour ago. It's watching us, Sarah whispered. Let it watch, I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Tomorrow we start hunting it. But as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the hunters in this scenario. We were the prey. And somewhere in the vast darkness of Yellowstone, the Martin family was experiencing horrors beyond imagination. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the trees. After a tense breakfast, our group separated as planned. Rodriguez, Chen, and Mackenzie headed southeast to continue searching along the Martins' original route, while Sarah, Jack, and I prepared to locate the cave system. 5 miles north, you said? I confirmed with Jack as we shouldered our packs. He nodded, but his expression was troubled. The journey will be more difficult than the distance suggests. The Wendigo knows what we're planning. It will try to confuse us, separate us. Stay close. Establish frequent comm checks, I instructed, checking my satellite phone's battery. If anyone sees or hears anything unusual, speak up immediately. Sarah adjusted her pack. What about the cold spots? Should we be tracking temperature changes? Good idea, I agreed, distributing digital thermometers from my kit. Significant drops could indicate its presence. As we moved deeper into the forest, the mist thickened until visibility dropped to mere yards. Trees loomed like spectral sentinels, their shapes distorted in the fog. Our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing all sound. Jack led the way, occasionally consulting his grandfather's journal and marking trees with orange surveyor's tape to ensure we could find our way back. After about an hour, he stopped abruptly, raising his hand for silence. Listen, he whispered. At first I heard nothing. Then, faintly, voices. Multiple conversations overlapping, as if we were approaching a crowded ranger station or visitor center. But we were miles from any official park facility. "It's trying to lure us off course," Jack warned. "The voices aren't real." Sarah's face had gone pale. "That's my mother's voice. She's been dead for 5 years. I could hear it too. Voices from my past. My father calling my name. An ex-girlfriend laughing. A fellow ranger who died in a rock slide years ago asking for help." "Ignore them," Jack insisted. "Focus on me, on each other. That's real." We pressed forward, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. The mist swirled around us, creating phantasmal shapes that dissolved when directly observed. The temperature began to drop noticeably, our breath forming clouds in the increasingly frigid air. After another half-mile, we discovered the first sign that we weren't just chasing legends. A massive tree had been marked with symbols similar to those in Jack's journal. Concentric circles with lines radiating outward, carved deep into the bark and filled with some dark substance. "My grandfather's generation renewed these markers," Jack explained, running his fingers over the symbols. "They form a boundary line. Beyond this point, the Wendigo's influence grows stronger." "So we're on the right track," I said, feeling a mix of validation and dread. Sarah had been documenting everything with her camera, but suddenly lowered it, frowning. "These readings don't make sense. It's 20 degrees colder here than it was 50 yards back." A branch snapped loudly somewhere behind us. We spun around, but the mist made it impossible to see more than a few yards. "We should keep moving," Jack urged. As we continued, the forest changed subtly. The trees grew more twisted, their bark blackened in patches. Fungi that shouldn't thrive in this ecosystem covered fallen logs. The ground became spongy underfoot, releasing a fetid odor with each step. "The land is corrupted," Jack murmured. "The Wendigo's presence poisons everything around it." 2 hours into our hike, we reached a small clearing where the mist thinned slightly. In the center stood a crude structure, branches and saplings bent into a dome-like shape, covered with— "Oh God," Sarah gasped. Clothing. The dome was partially covered with torn clothing, adult and children's sizes. I recognized a red jacket from the description of what Mrs. Martin had been wearing. Inside the structure, we found evidence of the family. A child's shoe, a man's wallet containing David Martin's driver's license, a woman's hair clip. But no blood, no bodies. "They were kept here," Jack said, examining the disturbed ground. "Recently." "Then they've been moved," I concluded, fighting rising panic. "Why would it move them?" Jack's expression darkened. "Because it knows we're coming." A child's scream shattered the silence coming from somewhere ahead of us. It was so sudden, so real, that we all instinctively moved toward it before Jack grabbed our arms. "Wait! Remember what I told you. It imitates voices." "What if it's not an imitation?" Sarah challenged. "We can't just ignore it." "We proceed carefully," I decided. Together. The cave entrance appeared suddenly through the mist, a dark gash in a rocky hillside, partially obscured by gnarled trees. Ancient symbols had been carved around the opening, similar to those we'd seen on the boundary tree, but more elaborate, more numerous. "This is it," Jack confirmed, his voice hushed with reverence and fear. As we approached the entrance, the temperature plummeted further. Ice crystals formed on our eyelashes and in our hair. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind. Sarah's thermometer beeped. 17 degrees Fahrenheit, she reported incredulously. In June. From deep within the cave came another sound, a child sobbing, followed by a woman's voice. "Please, someone help us." Sarah looked at me, her professional resolve cracking. "Mike, that sounds real." "Stay together," I repeated, but my own determination was wavering. The voices sounded so genuine, so desperate. We activated our headlamps and prepared to enter the cave. Jack stopped at the entrance, removing tobacco from a pouch at his belt and sprinkling it on the ground while murmuring words in his native language. "A offering of respect and a prayer for protection," he explained. The cave mouth seemed to inhale as we entered, a subtle shift in air pressure that made our ears pop. The temperature continued to drop, and our headlamp beams seemed dimmer than they should be, barely penetrating the unnatural darkness. About 20 yards in, the passage widened into a chamber. Our lights revealed ancient paintings covering the walls, depictions of the Wendigo and rituals to contain it. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark. "This is where the binding ritual would be performed," Jack explained. Sarah was examining the wall paintings. "These symbols, some of them match the ones from your grandfather's journal." I approached the altar, my light revealing grooves carved into the stone surface, channels designed to direct flowing liquid. I didn't need to ask what kind of liquid they were meant for. A scraping sound echoed from deeper in the cave system, like claws on stone. We froze, listening as it grew louder, closer. "It's here," Jack whispered. The temperature plunged further. Our headlamps flickered, threatening to leave us in total darkness. And from a tunnel at the far side of the chamber came a sound that would haunt my nightmares forever. A hideous blend of animal growl and human laughter. Then, stepping into the edge of our failing light beams, we saw it. 8 feet tall, emaciated yet somehow powerful, with skin stretched tight over an inhuman frame. Its head bore the skull of a deer, antlers extending like a crown of bones. Where eyes should be, only dark, empty sockets that somehow still conveyed malevolent intelligence. Its mouth, God, its mouth, stretched in a grin too wide for any human face, filled with needle-like teeth. Behind it, barely visible in the darkness, huddled 4 figures, the Martin family, alive but terrified beyond reason. The Wendigo tilted its head, studying us with those empty sockets. Then it spoke, using David Martin's voice. "They came to see nature. Now they're becoming part of it." It stepped forward, its movements jerky yet fluid, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. The air around it shimmered with cold so intense it burned. "You know why I chose them, don't you, Michael?" It continued, now using my voice. "The same reason I chose you. The darkness inside, the hunger." Sarah raised her rifle, but Jack pushed the barrel down. "Bullets won't stop it." The Wendigo laughed, a sound like breaking ice and snapping bones. "The old man is right. Nothing stops hunger. Nothing stops me." It lunged forward with impossible speed. I shoved Sarah aside as claws raked the air where she had stood. Jack threw something from his pouch, herbs or tobacco, that burst into flame upon contact with the creature, causing it to shriek and recoil. "The altar!" Jack shouted. "We need to lure it there." Sarah fired her rifle despite Jack's warning. The bullet struck the Wendigo's chest, causing it to stagger but not fall. Black ichor oozed from the wound. "Get the family!" I yelled to Sarah, drawing my knife, a pathetically inadequate weapon against this horror. As Sarah darted around the chamber's edge toward the huddled Martins, I moved in the opposite direction, drawing the Wendigo's attention. "You said you chose me," I called to it, backing toward the altar. "Why? What darkness do you see in me?" The creature followed, its movements becoming more fluid, more predatory. "You already know, Ranger. The incident 3 winters ago. The hikers you couldn't save. The ones you found too late." A cold realization washed over me. It was reading my deepest regrets, my most painful memories. "That wasn't his fault," Sarah shouted, having reached the Martin family and begun untying them. "Everyone has darkness," the Wendigo replied, still stalking toward me. "Everyone has hunger. Yours is for redemption, Michael. An insatiable appetite that can never be filled." I continued backing up until I felt the stone altar behind me. Jack had circled around and was frantically drawing symbols on the floor with a piece of charcoal, recreating patterns from the wall paintings. "You failed before," the Wendigo taunted. "You'll fail again. The family will die. Your friends will die. All because you weren't good enough, fast enough, brave enough." Its words cut deeper than its claws could, because part of me believed them. But as I looked past the creature to Sarah helping the terrified Martin family, something hardened inside me. "You're wrong," I said. "I may have failed before, but not today." I leapt aside as the Wendigo charged. It crashed into the altar, momentarily stunned. Jack completed the symbol circle and began chanting in his native language, his voice rising with power and conviction. The temperature dropped even further. Ice formed on the walls, cracking the ancient paintings. The Wendigo recovered and turned toward Jack, recognizing the greater threat. "Now, Michael!" Jack shouted between chants. "The binding requires blood freely given." I understood immediately. Drawing my knife across my palm, I let blood drip onto the altar in the symbols Jack had drawn. The effect was immediate. The symbols began to glow with a blue-white light, and the Wendigo shrieked in rage and what sounded almost like fear. An invisible force seemed to pull the creature toward the altar. It fought against it, claws scrabbling on the stone floor, leaving deep gouges. The Martin family, now free from their bonds, huddled against the far wall with Sarah protectively in front of them. "Keep going," I shouted to Jack, whose chanting had reached a fever pitch. The Wendigo fixed those empty eye sockets on me. "This prison won't hold me forever, Michael Thompson. I'll remember you. I'll find you again." "Maybe," I acknowledged. "But not today." With a final, bone-chilling howl, the creature was slammed against the altar by unseen forces. Ice crystals formed around it, encasing its limbs, then its torso, finally its skull-like head. The blue-white light from the symbols intensified until we had to shield our eyes. When the light faded, the Wendigo was gone. Or rather, transformed. In its place stood a grotesque ice sculpture, every detail of its horrific form perfectly preserved in crystalline stasis. Jack's chanting subsided, and he collapsed to his knees, exhausted. "It's done," he gasped. "Bound again, but not forever. Never forever." The Martin family wept with relief, clinging to each other and to Sarah, who looked as shell-shocked as I felt. "Is it dead?" Mrs. Martin asked, her voice hoarse from screaming. "No," Jack answered honestly, "but it's contained. The binding will hold for years, perhaps decades if we're fortunate." I approached the frozen Wendigo cautiously. Even in this state, I could feel malevolence radiating from it like cold from an iceberg. "We need to station guards," I said. "Set up a perimeter. Make sure no one ever comes here again." Jack nodded solemnly. "My people will help. This responsibility has been ours for generations." As we led the traumatized but miraculously unharmed Martin family from the cave, I couldn't shake the Wendigo's final words. It would remember me. It would wait. And someday, perhaps long after I was gone, it would hunger again. 3 months later, I sat in my cabin on the eastern edge of Yellowstone, watching the first autumn leaves drift from the aspens. My hand, still bearing the scar from the binding ritual, ached in the cooling air, a constant reminder of what lurked beneath the park's beauty. The official report on the Martin family incident cited exposure, disorientation, and mass hallucination induced by toxic fungi, a convenient explanation crafted jointly by park administration and Jack's tribal elders. The Martins themselves, after extensive debriefing and psychiatric evaluation, had agreed to the official narrative, too traumatized to fight for a truth no one would believe anyway. Sarah knocked on my door, entering with 2 cups of coffee. Since that night in the cave, we'd grown closer, united by a shared experience few could understand. Rodriguez called, she said, settling into the chair opposite mine. Another temperature anomaly near Lamar Valley. Third one this month. I nodded, unsurprised. Within the established perimeter? Yes, but getting closer to the boundary. Jack's people say the binding is holding, but the Wendigo is testing its limits. I finished. After our encounter, Jack had shared more of his grandfather's journal, revealing a cycle we now found ourselves part of. The Wendigo had been bound before, many times throughout history. Each binding lasted longer than a human lifetime, but never permanently. And each time it broke free, it emerged stronger, smarter, more determined. The new monitoring stations are online, Sarah continued, pulling out her tablet to show me a map of the park with dozens of temperature sensors marked in red. If it attempts to breach the perimeter, we'll have advance warning. I traced the scar on my palm. Warning won't be enough. We need to be ready. Since the incident, I'd thrown myself into research, collecting folklore from tribes across North America about similar entities. Jack had introduced me to elders from other nations who shared their knowledge of binding rituals and containment methods. I'd compiled everything into a manual, a guidebook for future rangers who might face what we had. The special training program starts next month, Sarah reminded me. 10 rangers from across the national park system, hand-picked, discreet, and skeptical, no doubt, I added with a grim smile, until they visit the cave. No one could stand before that frozen horror and remain skeptical. We'd established a secure facility around the cave entrance, disguised as an environmental research station, with round-the-clock guards drawn from both park rangers and tribal members. Only those with special clearance could enter, and only after extensive psychological evaluation. Because the Wendigo fed on weakness, on darkness within. Anyone harboring significant trauma or guilt could become its conduit to freedom, including me. Jack called this morning, I told Sarah. He's been translating some older texts. Apparently the blood bond works both ways. The binding ritual connected me to it somehow. Sarah's expression tightened with concern. What does that mean exactly? I dream of it sometimes, I admitted. I feel its hunger, its rage, its patience. I hadn't told anyone about these dreams before, not even Sarah. It's waiting, gathering strength. And it knows me now, knows how I think. Mike, maybe you should take a leave of absence. Get some distance. That's exactly what it wants, I interrupted. For me to run, to hide, to pretend it isn't real. Distance won't break the connection. The truth was more complicated than I could express. In those dreams, the Wendigo whispered to me, promised me things. Power, knowledge, freedom from fear. It probed my deepest insecurities and regrets, offering resolution if only I would help release it. So far, I'd resisted. But each night, its arguments grew more persuasive, more personal. There's something else, Sarah said, interrupting my dark thoughts. The historical research you requested came through. There have been patterns. She handed me a folder containing old newspaper clippings, ranger reports, and tribal accounts dating back to the park's founding. Disappearances, mysterious deaths, reports of wild men or forest demons appeared in clusters spanning roughly 50 to 70 years, consistent with the binding cycle Jack had described. It's happened before, I murmured. Many times. And each time there were people who fought it, who bound it again. Sarah placed her hand over mine. You're not alone in this, Mike. That evening, after Sarah left, I stood on my porch watching the sunset paint Yellowstone's mountains gold and crimson. The beauty of this place had always moved me, had drawn me to become a ranger in the first place. Now I understood I wasn't just protecting the wilderness from human harm. I was protecting humans from what lurked within the wilderness. As darkness fell, I felt that familiar cold sensation, like being watched from just beyond the light. A branch snapped in the forest beyond my cabin. Probably a deer or elk. But I found myself reaching for the special pack I now kept by the door, containing Jack's herbs, iron implements, and my own blood stored in vials. "I know you're there," I called into the darkness. "I know you're listening, and I want you to know something. I'll be ready when you return." Only silence answered. But as I turned to go inside, I noticed frost forming on my porch railing, in August. And faintly, carried on a wind that shouldn't exist, I heard my own voice whisper back, "So will I, Michael Thompson. So will I." The wilderness holds many secrets, beauty and terror alike. I've seen both now, and I can never unsee them. The tourists who visit Yellowstone marvel at its wonders, unaware of what sleeps beneath their feet, bound by ancient magic and modern vigilance. They say knowledge is power. But some knowledge is a burden, a responsibility that can never be set down. As I closed my cabin door against the unnatural cold, I understood that my life had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just a park ranger. I was a warden of older, darker boundaries. And somewhere in the depths of Yellowstone, frozen but aware, the Wendigo waited for me to fail. I don't intend to. I grew up in the remote foothills of the Cascade Mountains in western Washington during the early 1990s. Our family owned a substantial parcel of forested land that stretched from the valley floor up into the lower ridges. Our home, a sturdy two-story timber frame structure, stood as a testament to my father's craftsmanship. Dad built it himself over 3 consecutive summers, using locally sourced Douglas fir and cedar from our own property. Our homestead sat at the end of a winding gravel road, nearly 2 miles from our nearest neighbor. My father, Richard, worked as a long-haul trucker specializing in oversized equipment transport, which often took him away for extended periods. His routes frequently stretched from Seattle to Alaska via the Alcan Highway, requiring weeks on the road during his busiest seasons. Mom maintained our 5-acre vegetable garden and small orchard, while also working part-time as a bookkeeper for the local lumber mill. We were largely self-sufficient, preserving our harvest to last through the long winter months and hunting for supplemental protein. Dad taught me basic hunting and wilderness skills from an early age, including how to track animals, identify edible plants, and navigate using natural landmarks. By the summer of 1992, when I was 12 years old, I had become exceptionally comfortable in the wilderness surrounding our property. The forest was my playground, classroom, and sanctuary. Unlike many kids my age who gravitated toward video games and television, I preferred the company of towering trees, babbling creeks, and the diverse wildlife that called the Pacific Northwest home. My father had crafted me a handmade bow from yew wood for my 10th birthday, along with a set of practice arrows. I had become quite proficient with this gift, often practicing by shooting at fallen logs or setting up makeshift targets throughout the forest. I carried a small field guide to local plants and animals, meticulously documenting my observations in a weather-resistant notebook my mother had given me. I had an older sister, Sarah, who at 16 had developed different interests. While she had once joined me on forest expeditions, she now preferred spending time with friends in town whenever possible. This left me to my solitary explorations, which suited my contemplative nature perfectly. I had mapped nearly every creek, ridge, and distinctive landmark within a 3-mile radius of our home. Mom worried about my solitary wanderings, but Dad assured her that I possessed better wilderness sense than many adults he knew. As a compromise, I carried a whistle and was required to return home before dusk each day. This system had worked effectively for nearly 2 years without incident. The summer of 1992 had been unusually dry in our region. By early August, the forest floor crackled underfoot and seasonal creeks had diminished to mere trickles. Fire warnings reached critical levels, though our property remained relatively verdant due to the natural springs that dotted our land. Dad had been away for nearly 3 weeks on an extended haul to Prudhoe Bay in Alaska. Mom divided her time between her bookkeeping duties and preparing for the upcoming harvest season. Sarah had secured a summer job at the local diner in town, leaving me with abundant free time for exploration. During this period, I began noticing subtle changes in the forest. Wildlife patterns seemed altered. Deer congregated in areas they typically avoided, and the usual chorus of birds occasionally fell silent without apparent cause. I attributed these changes to the unusual weather conditions and continued my daily expeditions. On August 12th, Mom needed to drive Sarah to her shift at the diner and then attend to banking matters in town. I, as usual, planned a day of exploration. Mom reminded me to be home well before sunset and to carry extra water due to the heat. Before departing, she helped me prepare a lunch of venison jerky, homemade bread, and dried fruit to sustain me throughout the day. I set out that morning with my bow slung across my back, my field guide and notebook secured in a small backpack, along with my lunch and 2 canteens of water. My destination was a ridge approximately 2 miles northeast of our property, an area I had marked on my hand-drawn map but had not yet thoroughly explored. The ascent proved more strenuous than I'd anticipated due to the heat. By midday, I'd reached a clearing near the ridge summit that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. I ate my lunch there, recording observations about the unusual clarity of the air and the distant silhouette of Mount Baker visible on the horizon. After lunch, I continued along the ridgeline, discovering a narrow game trail that wound through a stand of ancient cedar trees. The massive trunks, some wider than my outstretched arms could encompass, created a cathedral-like atmosphere. The dense canopy overhead reduced the midday sun to dappled patterns on the forest floor, providing welcome relief from the heat. Following the game trail led me to a small valley nestled between 2 ridges. At the center of this valley lay a perfectly circular clearing approximately 50 feet in diameter. What struck me immediately was the absence of underbrush within the circle, just short, uniform grass, unlike the typical forest floor vegetation. At the center of this clearing stood a single young alder tree, its white bark gleaming in stark contrast to the surrounding conifers. I approached cautiously, scientific curiosity overcoming my initial wariness. The edge of the clearing formed a precise boundary between the typical forest undergrowth and the unusual short grass. I noted this anomaly in my journal, sketching the clearing and recording its approximate location on my map. As I completed my documentation, I noticed the forest had fallen unnaturally silent. The constant background chorus of birds and insects had ceased entirely. The air felt suddenly heavy, carrying a subtle metallic scent reminiscent of approaching thunderstorms, though the sky remained clear. Checking my watch, I realized it was already mid-afternoon. Concerned about keeping my promise to return home before dusk, I prepared to depart. As I gathered my belongings, a faint humming sound emanated from somewhere above the clearing. The sound gradually intensified, vibrating through my chest cavity like the bass notes of a powerful speaker system. Looking skyward, I initially saw nothing unusual through the small opening in the forest canopy above the clearing. Then, a pinpoint of blue-white light appeared, hovering directly over the young alder tree. The light expanded slowly, transforming into a pulsating sphere approximately 3 feet in diameter. I stood transfixed as the sphere descended toward the alder tree. When it made contact with the uppermost branches, the tree's leaves appeared to shimmer and dance, though no wind was present. The humming sound modulated, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost musical in its complexity. As the sphere continued its descent, smaller points of light, ranging from brilliant green to deep indigo, began to orbit around it. These smaller lights moved with startling speed, yet maintained perfect synchronization with each other. They resembled a miniature galaxy rotating around a blue-white sun. Overcoming my initial shock, I fumbled for my notebook, attempting to sketch what I was witnessing. As I did so, the primary sphere suddenly expanded to nearly twice its original size, emitting a pulse of light so intense that I was momentarily blinded. When my vision cleared, The sphere had split into 3 identical orbs, each now pulsating with a distinct rhythm. I heard what I could only describe as voices, not spoken language, but a series of harmonic tones that somehow conveyed meaning. I couldn't comprehend the specific content, but felt an overwhelming sense that the phenomenon was not random, but purposeful, perhaps even communicative. What happened next would become the most difficult part of my story for others to believe. One of the 3 spheres detached from the formation and approached me directly. As it drew near, I experienced a profound sense of calm rather than fear. The sphere hovered approximately 10 feet away, at eye level. Without conscious thought, I extended my hand toward the light. The sphere responded by emitting a narrow beam that connected with my outstretched palm. Rather than heat, I felt a mild tingling sensation, similar to the static electricity of a balloon rubbed against fabric. This connection lasted perhaps 20 seconds, during which I perceived a rapid succession of images, mountain vistas, underwater scenes, celestial bodies, none familiar to me yet all somehow recognizable. When the beam retracted, the sphere rejoined its companions above the alder tree. The 3 lights reintegrated into a single entity, which then ascended rapidly, diminishing to a pinpoint before vanishing entirely. As suddenly as it had disappeared, the forest sounds resumed. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the distant gurgle of a small stream, as if nothing unusual had occurred. I remained in the clearing for several minutes, trying to process what I had witnessed. My watch, which had read 3:15 p.m. before the encounter, now showed 5:48 p.m. Over 2 hours had apparently elapsed, though the experience seemed to have lasted only minutes. Alarmed by the time discrepancy and aware that I would be late returning home, I gathered my belongings and began retracing my steps down the ridge. As I departed, I glanced back at the clearing. The alder tree, which had appeared ordinary before the encounter, now displayed a spiral pattern in its bark that ascended from the base to the uppermost branches. I navigated the return journey with considerable difficulty. Disorientation plagued me, causing me to mistake familiar landmarks and twice lead myself in circles before regaining my bearings. The setting sun cast long shadows through the forest, further complicating navigation. My typically excellent sense of direction seemed compromised, as if some internal compass had been temporarily recalibrated. When I finally emerged from the forest edge near our property, full darkness had descended. The lights from our home glowed warmly in the distance, and I could discern the silhouette of my mother's figure pacing on the front porch. As I approached, Mom rushed to meet me, relief and anger competing in her expression. "Thomas James Davidson, do you have any idea what time it is?" she demanded, simultaneously pulling me into a tight embrace. "I was about to call the ranger station." I attempted to explain my experience, but found myself struggling to articulate what had occurred. My normally precise vocabulary failed me, and the extraordinary encounter seemed to resist conventional description. What emerged instead was a fragmented account that Mom attributed to exhaustion and possible dehydration. "You're burning up," she observed, pressing a hand to my forehead. "Inside, right now. A cool bath, dinner, and straight to bed." I didn't argue. My body felt unusually heavy, and a persistent buzzing sensation lingered at the edges of my consciousness. That night, my sleep was punctuated by vivid dreams, filled with geometric patterns and landscapes I had never seen. Vast deserts, tropical lagoons, Arctic tundra, all bathed in the same blue-white light I had encountered in the clearing. I awoke the following morning with a low-grade fever and unusual markings on my right palm, a pattern of interconnected circles resembling the rings of a tree, centered where the light beam had connected with my hand. Mom, concerned about potential exposure to some unknown plant toxin, applied a poultice of plantain leaves and kept me home to rest. Over the next 3 days, my fever subsided, and the markings on my palm gradually faded. However, other changes became apparent. My previously 20/40 vision had improved dramatically. a fact confirmed weeks later during a routine school physical, which recorded my visual acuity at 2015. I found myself able to recall information from books read years earlier with photographic precision. Most notably, my artistic ability, previously limited to rudimentary sketches, had developed extraordinarily. My drawings of the light phenomenon displayed a technical sophistication far beyond my previous capabilities. When Dad returned from his hauling job the following week, I finally found someone receptive to my account. Unlike Mom, who had dismissed the story as a product of heat exhaustion or an overactive imagination, Dad listened intently, asking detailed questions about the experience. "Your grandfather used to tell a similar story," Dad revealed after I completed my account. "He worked as a fire lookout in these mountains back in the 1940s. Said he saw lights dancing above the trees during a lightning storm. Nobody believed him either." With my father's encouragement, I documented my experience in detail, creating a comprehensive record that included drawings, maps, and a written narrative. We agreed to keep the full account private, knowing how such stories tended to be received in our small community. Dad accompanied me on a return expedition to the circular clearing 2 weeks later. We found the location without difficulty, but the scene had changed significantly. The perfect circle remained visible, but the central alder tree had died completely, its leaves brown and brittle, its bark displaying the spiral pattern I had described. Samples collected from the tree and soil showed no obvious contaminants or pathogens when later examined by a forester friend of Dad's. As years passed, I occasionally shared my experience with trusted individuals. Most reacted with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. The markings on my palm never fully disappeared, though they faded to faint white lines visible only under certain lighting conditions. My enhanced mental capabilities persisted, enabling me to excel academically and eventually pursue a career in environmental science. I returned to the circular clearing numerous times throughout my life, sometimes alone, sometimes with companions. The phenomenon never recurred, though I occasionally experienced unusual equipment malfunctions in the vicinity, compasses spinning erratically, watches stopping temporarily, camera batteries draining inexplicably. The alder tree eventually fell and decomposed, but nothing new grew in its place. The circular clearing remained a perfect void in the forest undergrowth, defying natural succession patterns. Local wildlife seemed to avoid the area entirely. No tracks, no droppings, no evidence of feeding or nesting activities within the boundary of the circle. When I became a grandfather myself, I began sharing my experience with my grandchildren during summer camping trips on the family property, which I had inherited and preserved as a nature reserve. My story evolved from a personal anecdote to a family legacy, though I always emphasize the importance of critical thinking and scientific inquiry when discussing unexplained phenomena.